Floor is yours.
Great. Hi, everyone. It's so nice to join you. As I am switching over our screen, let's see if, oh, I can, and I can still see you. If you could give me an emoji thumbs up if you are able to see the slides, that would be helpful. Thank you so much for that feedback. Well, I'm really excited to be with you all today. I'm sorry the lighting is super weird. I am at a conference and I am in a hotel room. So, you get what you get when you're in hotel rooms giving talks. So if for some reason the internet goes out or something gets weird or wonky, my phone's beside me. And we will make it work. So I'm excited to talk to you all about single case today. What I'm going to do is, just play a little technical game with myself. There we go. Okay, we're going to have a little bit of interaction today um, for folks so that you are able to hopefully stay awake during this talk. So if I can see a quick emoji hand up, if you have conducted single case research or if you consume it while reading it, or if you are interested or have been part of a team that's conducted single case research. All right, a couple of folks. Okay, great. Well, if you don't use this type of methodology, you're welcome to, join along for the ride and maybe it'll help you consume the information. And for folks who are conducting it, I hope this is an opportunity to bring you all access to some up-to-date standards that have recently come out. Oh no. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing for just a minute because my PowerPoint is not advancing. So I apologize. And let me see if I can get it to work.
Yes.
Inevitably, right? When you test it out before you're talking, then you go to talking, it doesn't work. As it does. Okay, let's see if we can do this. I'm just gonna have to do it. I apologize. I'm not in presenter view, and it looks like it'll work now. All right. Okay, so I apologize. You're gonna have to see the little dots on the side, but at least we'll be able to get you guys access. Okay, so I want to quickly have some introductions, and I want to acknowledge my co-authors on this project. I'm going to give a brief review of design standards, what they mean, how they've originated, and then we're going to go over some key principles. I know that Dr. Mosconi included the article to which I'm referring today in the calendar invite, and I also put some links in the chat for folks. And then I want to share some additional resources that are available and also have time for questions. If at any point during my talk you have questions or things come up, please feel free to jump in, use one of the emoji features or drop in the chat or just unmute yourself and interrupt me and I'll be happy to answer any questions. So as was mentioned, I'm an assistant professor over in the Department of Special Education and my work focuses on supporting young children preschool through second grade who are experiencing language and behavioral support needs that may or may not yet be identified by the educators or caregivers in their lives. And so the reason why I am a single case methodologist and why this type of method tends to lend itself to the work that I'm doing is I go in and I partner with educators who say, this is a kiddo who's struggling and they're able to easily identify that this child and perhaps the educator also need more support, but they're not yet sure exactly what's going to work. For many of these young children, they don't yet have support services. And so it's a little bit of a game of trial and error for many of these young children. It's also their first experience in a classroom setting. So they're having to learn the history of school, what are the unwritten curricula of learning and group environments, in addition to the educators and adults in their lives helping them identify the supports that are effective so that then they can advocate for those supports. And so single case is a flexible methodology that allows me to quickly make changes with children and teachers as we find something is working, or perhaps it's working, but they have a preference to tweak it in some way. This type of methodology allows me to experimentally evaluate it while recognizing and being cognizant to those iterative changes that may need to happen. So really quickly, you're welcome to use the chat feature or use the emoji features. If you could raise your hand if you are a doc student or a graduate student of any kind. Yeah. Okay. And how about postdocs? Great. And faculty? Anyone engaging in practice in whatever broad area of our interdisciplinary field you may be at? Great. Any caregivers? Okay, all right. Those are usually the broad groups, but if I forgot anyone, please feel free. Researchers, let's do that. I'm one of those. Yeah, we've got quite a lot of people who do research. Okay, so that helps give me a little bit of context for how to place this information. So I want to first acknowledge that I am a member of a team who helped in the development of these standards. So I need to acknowledge my colleagues here on the screen, Dr. Jennifer Ledford, Joseph Lambert, James Wistiowski, Nicole Hollins, and Erin Barton. We're fortunate to have Nicole Hollins here at Juniper Gardens, so you can always reach out to her too. Or any of these folks, feel free to email them. But we were able to collaborate to step back and say, what are the things that we really need to think about when we're engaging in rigorous single case design that brings in high quality rigorous design and the voices of those endogenous implementers and children and individuals with whom we partner and we work. And so just a brief overview, given we don't all use all the methods for the questions that we have. So single case is an experimental quantitative design. And when we talk about case, we're not talking about a case study. It is the unit of analysis. And so that could be an individual. It could be a dyad. It could be a caregiver and a child. It could be an educator and a child. It could be two students or two adults. It could be a small group in an educational or community setting. And the key here is that we have two adjacent conditions, typically one with no intervention and one with an intervention present, and that we are looking at when I place the intervention or the strategy in place, and then I do it over multiple demonstrations, at least 3 different points. Do I see the data change in a similar way each time my conditions change? And so that might be across people, it might be across settings. And then we also have an ability to compare strategies or interventions. I'm not going to highlight that as much today, but I want to acknowledge that we also can answer some comparative questions about efficiency, about effectiveness, and then also we can use some designs to evaluate preference. And the way that we analyze these outcomes are through graphical analysis. So we graph the data using a time series, which I'm going to show in just a minute. And then we have a technique called visual analysis, which should be a more structured protocol. And then there are some ways to quantitatively create indices for magnitude. We are right in the zeitgeist of doing that in single case, understanding we have small cases, we have multiple data that are autocorrelated, that are serially dependent. And so those methods are rapidly changing. That's beyond the scope of today, but if anyone's interested in that, I am happy to grab a coffee and chat with you about it. So here are 3 main categories of single case design, just to kind of pull that out of your brain if you haven't talked about it since perhaps a research overview method. And so one is a sequential introduction, and this is similar to what I talked about earlier, where we're measuring an outcome of interest. It's an outcome that we expect to change pretty rapidly when the environment changes. And we're looking at changes between 2 adjacent conditions. We're going to implement a strategy, then we're going to take it away and we're going to implement it again. And we're looking for consistency in similar conditions, and we're looking for changes immediately when those conditions change. We also have a time-lagged introduction where instead of intervening and then removing it, and to be able to test those adjacent conditions, we are going to intervene across different individuals, settings, or outcomes. And we're going to do that in a time-lagged fashion. So rather than doing it all at once, I have my demonstrations by baseline to intervention here, a second demonstration here at a different point in time, a third demonstration here at a third point in time, and a fourth demonstration here at a fourth point in time. And so what I'm looking at is to see, do I see the data patterns consistently change for each time point where I'm switching between the intervention being present or absent? These are very rote methods of describing this. If you want to go into more detail and get more technical, again, please let me know, but I'm just kind of going to push us through. And here's a rapid iterative alternation. And this is an opportunity where we can compare 2 strategies, or we can compare 2 strategies to each other and to the absence of an intervention. So there are many of you for whom you have areas of interest or research questions where these are not the appropriate designs or methods to answer those questions, and that's totally okay. And so in this instance, rather than comparing at this condition change, we are going to compare between the data series. So here is our first strategy, strategy A, our second strategy, strategy B, and we're going to conduct an analysis between each series of data points. So do we see differentiation or clear vertical space between the two data paths? And if we see that consistently, then we can be confident that the outcomes for strategy A in the open path seem to produce worse outcomes than intervention B, because in this instance, we want to decrease challenging behavior. All right, you just got 2 semesters worth of single case coursework in about 3 minutes. You're all ready to go. So I want to contextualize a little bit the history of the standards. So in single case design, there have generally been quite a few fields that have utilized this type of method to answer questions of interest. That could be in the world of behavior analysis or ABA. It could be in speech language hearing sciences, in educational research. And frankly, what is considered a high quality or rigorous single case design is contingent on which one of those places you're entering into using the methodology. And so if you do a lot of reading about this type of research method, for example, from the behavior analytic tradition, you're going to get very different information about what counts as good compared to the educational application of single case methodology. And so I want to be very clear that I'm coming from, although I'm a behavior analyst, I'm coming from an applied perspective of understanding single case outside of behavior analysis or behaviorism, but rather understanding it as a research method that can be applied by anyone who has a question in which they expect a pretty fast change in their outcome that is environmentally or contextually bound. And so the first set of design standards came out in 2005. And this was right around the evidence-based practice movement in special education due to some educational policy. And this was more broadly in education. Those of you all in the medical field have been ahead of us for decades. We're playing catch up over here in the world of education. And these initial standards came out and said, okay, as a field, we have generally agreed that these are the important parts of a single case design in order for the outcomes to be most likely related to the changes in your research study rather than some extraneous factor, right? And we have ways that we control for that and measure and account for that in all the designs and approaches that folks might use. And so between 2005 and now, there have been a plethora of standards and tools and indices that individuals can use to determine the quality or rigor of single case design. And so in 2018, I was able to work with quite a few of the authors on this paper, and we compared all of those tools. And what we found was that your overall determination of whether a study or a body of literature was rigorous and therefore trustworthy depended on the tool that you used. And so for those of us in research, that's pretty problematic, right? Our tools shouldn't impact what the data are. The data are what they are. And the tool that we use to analyze the data should only be a vessel that gets us to where the data are. But we found that that's actually not the case for what we knew about single case. And we think that perhaps part of that came from the fact that these design standards were starting to be used as checklists. If you did just these specific things, then this was a good study that you could trust, and this is how you know you're conducting high quality research. But as all of you all know, there are many more factors that impact high quality research than just did you follow this checklist. And so this set of design standards is not intended to be used as a checklist, but rather to be used as guidance, where individual study authors or synthesis conductors are going to have to make decisions about what makes sense for their topic of interest, for the body of literature that you may be contributing to, and for the broader space that your work has in that interdisciplinary community and collaboration to decide what are the things that are important. And so these new standards have really recognized the need for research teams that represent the individuals with whom we are partnering in our research, that research is elevating and prioritizing the voices of Indigenous stakeholders, so individuals who would be intended to use these strategies in the field, individuals who are receiving intervention, being able to have a voice. And what we also were able to recognize is that each of these specific standards or these specific guidelines, while there are some broad ones that we all can agree contribute to high quality science and ethical science, that there were details around types of methodologies that needed to be further outlined. And so within the Division for Research of the Council for Exceptional Children, which is a professional organization in special education, teams of scientists and methodologists combined in the last couple years to create new guidelines and standards across a variety of methods. So I'm just presenting one of those to you today. I see Dr. Carrie Sjogren's on the call. She worked on another one. So there are quite a few people here at KU who would be happy to talk about any of these. For example, if you conduct secondary data analyses, there are some guidelines of considerations. But today we're just going to talk about single case. And I want to be clear, these are going to be the guiding things that we move through as we go along, as there are 3 areas to consider when conducting a single case study. And that a strength of a study shouldn't be determined by did you checklist and have X number of data points at these particular times, but rather, how are you considering internal validity, external validity, and your reporting techniques? And that perhaps a high quality study could have high quality related to internal validity, but pretty low quality and rigor related to reporting. And so rather than making a blanket statement that this study is good or this study is bad or this study is high quality and rigorous or this study is less rigorous and therefore less trustworthy, we need to be a bit more nuanced in our analysis and in the considerations that we're making as we are trying to conduct primary studies. And so I'm going to go through each of these again. And as I go through these, I want you to think about turning the gears. So when you say, okay, for me, I'm interested in what are the coaching practices that are most preferred and most efficient and effective for educators in kindergarten classrooms so that all 5-year-olds who live in that world, in that area, are able to go to the same classroom. What do I need to do? And so for me, looking at how we're supporting young kids with language and behavioral support needs in kindergarten, I'm going to really make sure that my reporting standard and that gear is turned all the way up. I want to be really precise in my reporting. I want to have exemplars of my materials. I want the exact steps and materials and decisions that I made as the research team to be transparent to folks reading my study, because we don't have a lot of information about how these decisions are being made. We have a lot of studies that tell us, here are the strategies that work for these young children, but often for about 50% of these young children, behavioral interventions that are designed to improve engagement need an adaptation. Well, that makes sense. Humans are variable, right? But what has happened is that in this body of literature, we have not reported how we decided to make the adaptation, when we decided to make the adaptation, what were the choices for the adaptation that were considered. Did the child have a say in what adaptation was picked? Did the educator or the caregiver have a say? Did we do it based on what the data looked like, or did we make decisions on the front hand and say, okay, if this condition occurs, or if these are what the data look like, then here are the 2 things we're going to try, and here's the order. We don't have a lot of information, which is pretty problematic for educators, knowing that about half of these children who are going to need some additional supports identified early in their schooling are going to need you to tweak it. And we have no guidance right now on how you tweak it. And so then what are educators supposed to do? But so perhaps that means that some of my internal validity mechanisms I might turn down a little bit, because I really want to see, does this work for educators? I know that when researchers implement a study or a visual support, for example, we know that visual schedules will increase engagement. For many of you all, we know that, for example, for young children who identify as autistic or who have autism, we don't need another researcher study to tell us that a visual schedule is going to help a child complete a task. What we do need to know is, does that child like that material? Did the child get to choose the material? Does the educator or caregiver or therapist implementing like that material? Is the format great? Are the pictures just a bunch of Caucasian images that you got off the internet, but the child is not Caucasian, and therefore that's not super valid? And so those are the kinds of questions that these guidelines are asking. Is for your work, what's important? Is it important to have really high internal validity because you're early in investigating a practice and we don't really know if it's going to work? Are you at a place where we know something works, but we're not really sure how it's translating into practice in the field? How are we sustaining it with endogenous implementers, folks who would typically be doing it in their natural day? Have we asked the people receiving the intervention what they think about it, what their preferences are? If we haven't, then maybe that social validity, external validity dial needs to be turned up a bit more in the study that you're planning, because that hasn't yet been contributed in the literature. How are we doing? I know I'm talking very fast. Okay. All right. And so I think it's critically important, at least for me, right? I'll look at the literature And if I've actually planned my life well, I will have done a literature review, best case scenario, and published it and then conducted a study, right? That's what we all do. But reality is sometimes we don't. I'm partnering with an educator and they want to test something and I scramble to get an RB together and we do it. And so then I'm quickly searching through the body of literature. But what we want to emphasize with these new standards, it is critically important to know where your primary study falls in the broader range of the literature. And that does not mean just the single case literature. It means for this strategy or practice or intervention or coaching technique that you're using, what does the broader literature say? And where would think of it as a timeline? Where would your study fall in the life of that practice? Would you be early in initial stages because perhaps you're testing it in a new environment or you're testing it with a new individual? Or are you perhaps at the middle or end stage? And then we're saying, okay, for example, visual schedules. Please do not keep saying, oh, wow, does a visual schedule work? That's not the question we need to ask right now. We need to ask for whom or how do we make decisions? What goes on the visual? How many icons do we have? Who gets to choose the icons? We all use Outlook calendars and push notifications. Why are we continuing to cut out board maker symbols? When you become an adult, you use a visual schedule that is electronic. Can we give kids access to that? That's where our questions need to be. And so when I'm thinking about the purpose of my research, if my purpose is just to say, do visual schedules work, which this is my area of interest, so I will pick on myself. If my question in 2023 is, do visual schedules work to support young children with language and behavioral support needs to complete play activities in their classroom or to engage in play in their classroom in kindergarten? And I want to say, does it work? Then I have already failed to have a high quality study because I haven't spent time in our literature to say, we know it works. We don't know how to format it. We don't know what kids like. We don't know what educators or caregivers like. We don't know if it matters. Does the child need support knowing what they're supposed to do, or does the child need support knowing when it's going to be done? Does the child need support knowing how many questions they have to answer before you stop bugging them? Or is it just, I nebulously sit on this carpet and some person tells me what to do? And frankly, it's very annoying because I've never been in school and no one has ever told me to sit on a rug with 20 people in some magical special spot silently, crisscross. And I just don't know what it is you want me to do in this procedure. And so in that instance, we need to step back and say, what is our purpose? And what are one of those three dials? What is critically the most important? What is secondarily the most important? And then what is it okay if I'm not perfect at? And in part of that, we also have to understand that our limitations as a research team. So I'm a junior scholar. I do not have a huge team. There are three of us. There are things that are incredibly rigorous related to measurement and internal validity that frankly, I do not have the money or staffing to do. And so what I need to do is say what's feasible. And for me, if I want educators to implement this strategy, then I need to go ask the educator, hey, this is what I think the steps should be. Is this reasonable for you? If it is not, then I need to fix what I'm doing. And all of that occurs before I measure sufficient reliability and fidelity and have sufficient data reporting. This is all in the planning. And I think it's something that we would argue has been missed in prior considerations of high quality, rigorous research. So the second key point of our next generation of considering what is high quality, rigorous single case design is that we need to flexibly apply guidelines. And I've perseverated on this for the last 26 minutes, that humanity is not one size fits all. Research is not one size fits all. If right now I put a topic in the chat, all of us would probably find a different way to approach that phenomenon. And they would all be valid and they would all be important if we were ethically considering the voices of the people who were impacted and we were making sure that the question that we had matched the design that we selected. And in single case, one of the fair criticisms is that visual analysis relies on our analysis of what the time series data points look like or what that graph looks like. And when data are stable, then we change conditions. We want the data to be stable because we want to make sure that we don't have variability occurring that we need to figure out. However, in doing that, our new quantitative approaches to creating an index for magnitude can automatically be elevated the more data you collect. And so now we need to have this consideration. How am I making decisions about condition changes? How am I making decisions about how long I'm going to be in intervention, or how long I'm going to wait till I intervene, or how long I'm going to wait until I stop intervening? We need to make those decisions understanding that the decisions that we make absent of what the data look like can influence future analyses of our work within single case synthesis. Well, the amount of people who can conduct those quantitative indices are less than 10 right now, because it's from 2018 to now. All of the indices and guidelines we thought we had are actually all wrong because the science has moved. And so we want to make sure that what we're deciding allows us to be fluid and rigorous at the same time. But that makes sense because everyone on this call has worked with another human, and none of us are tick boxes that work perfectly. And so we need to take a step. Our technology is advanced enough that we need to stop approaching our design selection and our study planning as tick boxes to check to be good enough. We also need to be really context specific. And so I don't have an answer here. We posit some considerations in the paper. So let's go back to my visual schedules example. So right now I am testing if we can embed opportunities to respond on a schedule for young kids who are engaging in challenging behavior, who need to improve their engagement because they just need to access instruction and they haven't yet. And so for these children, the schedule might look like go to the place, so like go to the carpet, look at the teacher, here are 3 question marks, pick any 3 things you want to answer, and then you get to ask to leave and you can go do what you want to do. Because we know if kids are having OTRs and they're getting the answer right, your small group instruction is going to be where we deliver that targeted support in kindergarten anyways, not in a group of 25. And so if I'm conducting the study and I have video cameras and I can analyze the data via video, and so I can go back and pause and re-record, and it can automatically stop it at momentary time sampling every 5 seconds. I need to be pretty strategic that I'm collecting sufficient reliability data or secondary observer data so I can decide, do my observers who are conducting an observational measurement, are they measuring to the standard and to the descriptor of engagement that I described? However, my ideal, this is not the authors, this is me. My ideal world is where we are creating and generating evidence in partnership, in my instance, with stakeholders and collaborators. But then also there is evidence and knowledge that our stakeholders and collaborators and individuals who receive intervention have that we don't have yet in the research world. And so there's a place where we both are bringing information and can bring it together. So if an educator approaches me, I'm at a teacher conference right now, and they say, hey, I collected this visual, I put this visual schedule in place during writing to help a kiddo in my class understand how they can move their drawings to labels, because that's our first step in being able to move to writing. And they could use their alphabet chart, and it could be a bajillion letters. The spelling doesn't matter. We just want to start to get to that symbolic representation. And they say, look, I graphed the week that I didn't give them an alphabet chart, and then I graphed the week that they did, and look how many more letters per minute they wrote on the page. And they said, look, I think alphabet charts are helpful. And they say, will you help me publish this? Is it ethical for me to say, sorry, kindergarten teacher who spent all this time finding out something that works for your kid, you have no fidelity data, you have no secondary observer data, so what you did is no longer valid and we're not going to count it? The really rigorous researcher in me who analyzes rigor of studies is like, oh, we don't have these key things of fidelity and reliability. But also the human in me is like, oh my gosh, this teacher just went and tried something. Teachers are totally capable of saying, okay, take it away for a couple days and then put it back and let's see what happens. Do I need this internal validity rigor, this internal validity mechanism to be so high that if you don't have a certain threshold, I just ignore evidence? And so what we posit, which I'm going to show in a few slides, is that maybe we need to start considering, what type of evidence are we looking for? Because if I'm looking for evidence to say, is this effective? Maybe that educator who doesn't have reliability or fidelity data or have exact procedures that are replicable, maybe that's not contributing to my overall does it work, but it could contribute to, is it acceptable? Is it feasible? Is this something we can partner with in the future? A key principle in our new guidelines, and I would argue, Dr. Sherman, you can correct me if I'm wrong. This is across, frankly, all of the new guidelines that the Division for Research has put out, is that it is incredibly important to recognize systemic and structural barriers that research teams, that endogenous stakeholders, so by that I mean educators, therapists, caregivers, individuals who identify as disabled, how these quote effective strategies may be differentially effective or supportive or prohibitive for different individuals, that our materials and our considerations of procedures and requirements for quote effective practice in our studies need to highlight and prioritize those that the participants and the individuals and stakeholders who would eventually be implementing these strategies, or who hopefully are implementing them if you're doing visual schedules like me, their priorities and preferences. We can conduct a simultaneous treatments design alongside a comparison design, and all that's doing is measuring. When I give you a choice, what do you prefer? I can ask you, I can interview you, I can use a mixed method. Single case is not going to answer all of these questions, and it doesn't mean that it's good or that it's bad. It means that we need to be clear about our purpose, and we need to partner with folks who are able to conduct perhaps more rigorous measurement in areas of social validity than perhaps this methodology is capable of doing, which is okay. The fourth guiding principle is a requirement for me in my personal work. I'm not going to engage in intervention work that is not in a setting where all 5-year-olds are allowed to be because they're 5 and they have a rightful presence to be in an inclusive setting with other 5-year-olds. To simply test things in isolation, we posit, depending on where you are in the broader scheme of your literature, perhaps is a disqualifying factor for being a rigorous study if our literature and our knowledge has moved beyond that. Now, if it's something like clinical practice where an individual comes to a clinic and receives services, that's a different story. I'm someone who works with educators in classrooms. And that finally, when we're measuring social validity, we need to make sure that we're understanding our selection of materials, of procedures, of measurement is culturally relevant to both the individual who's receiving intervention, but also to the individuals who may be implementing. And the way that you figure out where you are in this continuum, like how do I know if Cassie really focused on reporting but didn't focus so much on external validity? Or how do I know if Olivia said, this is really new in my body of literature, and so I need to really focus on internal validity, and perhaps some of those external validity factors may not be as present, and I'm going to be transparent about why. The way I know that is you tell me as the author. So when I'm the reader and the consumer, I can understand, here are the ways that you made decisions around your design. Here are the ways that you made decisions to prioritize this one factor over another. And you recognize here are the potential limitations of making that decision, but here are also the benefits of that decision. And our biggest piece of advice is to use open science practices to pre-register studies, to if you are going to have a protocol that requires adaptation, even if it's, I'm going to ask the individuals involved, document that so that other individuals can see, here's the process, here's how I asked them, here was their feedback, here's where we made changes. And that when we are publishing primary studies, that we make sure that our reporting practices are transparent so that others can then support replication and movement further along the line of, hopefully for us, getting many of our practices, at least in my area of the field, in the hands of stakeholders rather than researchers. And so for me personally, I use open science framework. I know different areas of the field have different preferred open repositories, but to link those in primary documents and to recognize that if you are going to use a journal supplemental material, that's okay, but it still keeps it behind a paywall. So considering preprints and making preprints and materials transparently available through non-cost prohibitive measures would be helpful and should highly be considered. And so here are a couple of considerations I have for you all, and then I want to give us about 15 minutes to ask questions in chat or provide feedback and say, Katie, oh my gosh, no, this is too loosey-goosey, we're not into this. If you've opened up the document at all, I'm giving a broad overview. We have some pretty clear standards and things that should be met, but we want to broaden the conversation quite a bit. And so earlier I spoke about what type of evidence is relevant. And so we identified 7 areas where perhaps we want to consider where our study that we're trying to conduct is in the broader range of the literature. It's not just does this work or does it not? Has anyone decided, wow, the training in order to do this is so cost prohibitive that for me, no educator is ever going to be able to implement this practice, or the time intensity it takes. It is never going to happen if someone doesn't have some at least pre-made materials that folks can sort on. And so what we are positing is perhaps when looking through your area of interest and the broader literature, rather than just saying, do we know if something is effective, we consider what evidence do we have about this strategy or practice, or what information do we have about this setting related to this outcome? And being able to just plot it and say, okay, there is a lot of information that when I change the environment, there's context-bound behavior change. And we've got a pretty broad amount of studies that say that. So maybe I don't just need to say, does it work? Maybe I need to move over and say, okay, is this an outcome that I would expect to generalize? Is this, a near transfer or far transfer task? If it's far transfer, interest in measurement, single case is not the methodology for you for that particular question. But perhaps you want to know, okay, this worked, visual schedules are helpful for young kids who identify as autistic. For folks with an intellectual disability, we know now for young kids who perhaps don't have identified support needs yet, but who have low engagement, they're starting to be effective. Okay, well, a kindergarten teacher, for example, can't learn 13 different types of interventions for the 13 educational labels. That's insane. No one has the capacity for that. But can I start saying, well, here's a strategy that humans generally use to calendar, to schedule, or to let us know what's coming next? Well, how can we adapt it into ways that the students in that classroom find acceptable and can make choices around and advocate for, can create for themselves, and they're starting to build that skill? And then how can the teacher do it in ways that are feasible? So perhaps I'm comparing format, or I'm comparing tools for an educator to create the item. And maybe I need to go down here in feasibility and acceptability, or perhaps generality rather than just does it work, yes or no. So the last piece of information that I want to point out to you all, and I will re-drop it in the chat. So if you go to this article on the Exceptional Children Journal webpage, on the bottom right-hand corner, you will see supplemental material links, and that will take you to the Open Science Framework preprint page for these guidelines. So we recognize that making pretty general statements of, do you want to increase or decrease the gears for internal validity, social validity, and external validity, or reporting transparency might be tricky when reviewers, who are, spoiler alert, also all of us, or editors or funders want you to stick to some traditional checklist of standards. And so what we've done, the current standards are the SCD-DR standards. As we've moved through, here are a couple different existing standards that are accepted in special education and that are out there. And here are some ways or some similarities and differences that you can see in each of the areas that we have identified as important. We also only had so many manuscript pages and had a lot to say and wanted to give pretty discrete exemplars for folks who were reading. And so the second supplemental material we made lists all of our suggested practices. And then we identify a rationale for why we think that this suggested thought or practice is important. And then we also will list example studies to show here's what we consider a high quality exemplar of this particular practice or this particular piece of your study that we think you need to consider. And then finally, we have a supplemental material that is a table of those 3 areas or dials that I talked about across our 6 areas of consideration when planning a single case study or analyzing a single case primary study or analyzing a body of single case designs in a single case synthesis. And so for internal validity, again, we did it across our 6 areas. We said, okay, if you're wanting to analyze your data collection and analysis practices and you want to plan it for a study or want to analyze it for an existing study, here are the things that are going to be impacted by internal validity. External and social validity don't have any bearing on data collection and analysis, but there are reporting things that are important. Now, if you say to me, well, what if an implementer is an endogenous implementer and they're collecting data? We have information about that and participants and implementers, but this was just a quick screenshot for you. And then anything that we link as an exemplar, we have a full page of supplementals that just have all of those full citations so that folks can access it. And the last supplemental that we created templates for folks who are interested in conducting single case primary studies, who perhaps are spending a lot of time having to graph the data or having to format graphs. We have them preset for you for withdrawal, sequential introduction with withdrawal designs, time-lagged introduction designs, and rapid iterative alternation designs. And I want to be transparent here that, while I am giving a pretty broad overview of thinking about which gears you're going to turn and what needs to be turned all the way up or what you want to turn down, that this is pretty contingent on your access to single case information. So there are a couple of books that are out there. There are What Works Clearinghouse through the Institute through Education Sciences does a summer training institute. But in broadening our considerations for guidelines, we are pretty cognizant and working through, did we open up perhaps considerations of smaller research teams or considerations of folks who perhaps don't have all the resources to do all of the perfect things listed in the other standards or in our prior standards? Have we made it harder to interpret guidelines by making them more broad and perhaps limited folks access to being able to analyze or conduct single case? Or have we opened it up to a broader range of individuals who can contribute to the research literature and who are contributing, but perhaps aren't being acknowledged for their contributions? I'm not sure that we did all good in this process, and it's something that we're thinking through. So any feedback around that area, any of the authors, we would love to hear. But we just went on a real fast journey through some new single case guidelines. And so we have about 15 minutes, probably 10, so that everyone can gain back 5 minutes of your day for open with any questions. They can be logistical questions. They can be, Katie, I think what you're saying is ridiculous questions. It can be clarification questions, whatever makes sense for you all.
Yes, and please remember that you are welcome to drop those questions in the chat or raise your hand and unmute and ask the question on your own. Thank you so much for that talk. It was really informative, and I think a lot of the kind of concepts that you introduced today about the challenges with research and limiting what gets shared and what doesn't really apply broadly to research in general, not just to single case designs. And so it's really helpful to kind of think about this framework and like what we are excluding from being accessible to people based on kind of our standards of rigorous science. So thank you for sharing that. It's really, really helpful because of this.
Yeah, I think it's our attempt. Oh, I'm being recorded, aren't I? Okay. Forgive me, other authors, if you ever see this. I see it as our attempt to perhaps define positionality in single case. So other methodologies will pretty explicitly, authors will identify their positionality pretty early on in a primary study. And I think how I view the new standards are consider the positionality of your primary study in the broader scope of literature, but also consider your positionality as the researcher or as the collaborator or as the partner. What are the things that you valued or escalated in this study, and transparently say that. Here's how the decisions I made. Here's why I made them. Here's how I'm justifying them. And here's are the things that I know are limitations, because no individual study is going to solve all the problems.
Right.
Particularly, it will solve the problem in that one particular context for those particular individuals who accessed the strategy or intervention at that one particular point in time. And so I don't know that it solves the problem of why does this particular methodology not identify positionality within primary studies, but I think it is a way that we can increase transparency and perhaps address that very fair criticism.
Yes, and I think it diversifies the research as well, because you have like the example you gave of the teacher that said, oh, I tried this intervention with this child and that was really successful, and I did a no intervention versus intervention kind of ABA design and was really successful with it. But if that teacher is being shut out of the field of research because there wasn't the standards of rigor, then that approach, that process, or that tool does not get introduced into the literature, and literature becomes kind of an echo chamber that just reinforces the things that have been done before.
I think we would even argue it doesn't get introduced into the fund of knowledge.
Right.
That there, many educators will say, well, I have a lot of knowledge that is not in a 35-page paper anywhere.
Yes.
And so how can we kind of bridge those spaces and value knowledge in a variety of areas? I do want to be clear. There are still standards, but
yes,
we want to broaden things. The one thing I do want to really highlight is we did not create these as a checklist for evidence-based practice.
Right.
We do not intend for these guidelines to be used to identify evidence-based practices. That is not our intent. Our intent is to say, here are considerations when conducting single case, and you may have a variety of purposes, and that is fine. We do not believe that considering standards and guidelines should be synonymous with identifying evidence-based practice.
Right, I would agree with that. I want to make sure that I'm not taking up all of the question time. Please, if others have. Maria.
Hi, Katie, thanks for sharing this work. I actually hadn't had a chance to absorb it myself recently, so I was excited for this opportunity. Not a well-formed question, you know me, but I'm wondering, I'm thinking about all of the trainees that many of us have who want to do single case research for a thesis or part of their dissertation. And I think who historically we've been saying, yeah, test the effects of that intervention for those kids in those classrooms, or and how you or your group would propose we mentor those students to go beyond that, even though that's kind of a learning opportunity for them as well as publishing and research, and how we can use these guidelines to support those students. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, because I have the power in my lab, my students are required to conduct a narrative review in their area of interest and a quantitative outcomes analysis, either a meta-analysis or a systematic review using visual analysis prior to being able to propose a primary study. And the reason that I do that and require it, one, it gets them more contextually situated, particularly if we're exploring a new area, to recognize that effectiveness, they aren't allowed to analyze effectiveness until the second part of the review. They have to do a descriptive understanding of where the literature is at first, with the idea that just saying doesn't work. We have better technology than that. We need to move forward and prioritize. And so by doing that first descriptive review, so one of my students just looked at the ethics of non-compliance interventions. And so she used some professional ethics guidelines and then looked at developmentally appropriate practice and just looked at what types of assessments, how long are the assessments, what types of demands are we giving to children, and found that 0% were developmentally appropriate. beyond like, does noncompliance intervention work? And so her question was like, should we even be studying noncompliance? And so when she finished that review, she said, I can't ever study this. And I said, well, why not? And she said, because we're just doing stuff that, based on her review, she would argue is unethical for young children. We're not teaching children any skills. They're not becoming volitional agents in their own lives. All we're doing is just creating little robots, and we're just turning it on and off by asking 120 demands a minute.
Mhm.
And I mean, I would engage in challenging behavior at that point. And so I think the first step is to get into the literature for reasons other than it does this work. And I think the second is, I mean, we're screwing it up. So when we proposed a study now, and my first question is, where are you in the body of literature? That's the first question I ask now. Where is this study in the broader body of literature? And if you're not able to answer it related to our 6 domains, then we have to go back in the literature before we can talk about the study. And this student said, well, we have to have an educator implementer. We are far enough along where we know that educators are able to support young children during play. We know that educators can use these materials. So I think I have to train an educator. Great. So we reworked our study where she was going to provide coaching and the educator was going to implement. And then after spending time with the educator and the children, she came back and said, I think we need to pause. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, there's so many strengths. And what if this doesn't work? And this is an educator who has never implemented a research study before. And she said, I'm not, when you asked me where I was in the literature, yes, all those pieces were known. The materials had been used by educators. The outcomes had been addressed by educators. Some of the prompts and supports had been used by educators, but they'd never been used together. And she said, what if when you put them together, it's ineffective and I just wasted all this educator's time and trained them on something that isn't going to work? She said, what do I do? And so we problem solved and said, well, for the first individual, perhaps she needs to implement it. And then for the second, the educator needed to. And so we now just have a running document that had our initial plan, and we just track changes and we say, we made this change and here's why. So that when we go to write the paper and we go to share the results, we have all of that clearly documented to say, oh, upon interacting with our collaborators and hearing their voices and their priorities, we actually decided to make this change and step back and take our internal validity dial up a little bit and our external validity dial down a little bit. And here's why. And here's how we think we're going to move forward. And here's our a priori plan of how we're going to change those dials for the next participant. I don't know if that's the right way, but that's how we're trying it right now. Welcome to feedback from others.
It makes a
I mean,
lot.
I really like that approach because I think it fits well within the framework of kind of the guidelines that you're promoting, where you're recognizing that the people that you're working with are humans, whether that's the educators, whether that's the children, or whether that's the researcher, and recognizing like you have to make adjustments based on the things you learn along the way or the things you figure out along the way. And I think as long as you're transparent about that and that you're sharing those approaches and that thought process, I think that is moving the field forward.
We're also trying, I don't know if this is going to work, but she's keeping a log. And so our question right now is, she said, I'm really worried about kids' autonomy. And the whole point of the study is to teach children autonomy. And she's like very worried about it. And so I said, okay, well, when you're trying it at after each session, you're going to reflect on each step of your fidelity. Was there an opportunity for child voice here? And did I ignore it or did I hear it? So that we can then iteratively change the protocol moving forward and the procedure moving forward with that in mind. And so I think for me, I'm learning a lot from colleagues who engage in other types of research methodology for how we can be reflective as the team. Because like I said, I do visual schedules, so I don't pick any interventions. Educators pick all of it. I'm so far down the continuum of endogenous implementer. Internal validity is great and I will do it so we can be trustworthy, but I really have my social validity, external validity dial up in my specific intervention work, that having to do that for one project and pull back for another, I don't know how we're doing. So we're doing a lot more record keeping. Looks like we have time for one more question.
Hi, Katie.
Hi.
great talk. I have several questions, so I may email you after. But I guess I'm
Please.
wondering, I think that one of the things that really stands out to me that you said today that I feel like is so important for all of us to hear is sort of this motto of like flexible but rigorous, and that those two don't have to be mutually exclusive. And I really like the idea of using single case design in order to almost take a step back and re-examine a lot of the things that we do and take for granted that are being implemented as a one-size-fits-all kind of model, but really rethink like, well, how is this actually working and how is it really not working? And how can we sort of get our foot in the door to try new things? And I guess I'm wondering, I feel like it's a really useful strategy for not, I guess, just reinforming our practices and wondering how then once we've really established that something is working well, at least for some individuals through single case design, like what does the process look like then for scaling that back up to sort of reshaping larger field standards and getting those into larger implementation in therapeutic interventional studies.
Yeah. So the really cool thing is that the people who wrote the other design standards have considered many of these features as well, because frankly, we talk. And so I think smart designs provide one opportunity at a larger scale. I'm not an expert on smart design, so I'm probably going to say this wrong, and you guys should definitely check this against what I'm about to say. But I think smart design does provide an opportunity at a larger scale to be strategic about adaptation in a broader project at a larger scale where you are considering scalability, whereas in single case, no one can argue that I'm over here trying to take steps to scale in single case. It's not the purpose. If that's my purpose, I need to pick a new design. It's not that it's good or bad. It's just not all designs can solve all things. And so I think smart design is an opportunity to consider those formative changes and adaptations at strategic points throughout your study, particularly related to intervention research. And there is a really good book chapter that just came out on smart design. And if you email me, Cassie, I will send it to you. I will try to get the PDF copy from a friend. Or you'll get some really weird like screenshots that I turned into PDFs. I am not an expert in smart design, but I do know people who do it. And there are people on this call who do it, and labs who do it. So I think that is where I would say go.
Thanks. Yeah,
but you pushed me at my bounds of competence. So we're gonna have to find another collaborator.
I just figured that what's working well in single case design for certain individuals likely has a lot to offer to so many others who are just not taking part in the single case design. And there's always ways we can improve and better tailor our educational and interventional supports. And I think this is a great way to do it.
Thanks. That's a really great thought. Okay, well, I am a big stickler on I don't take away people's lifetime. Thank you all so much for having me today. I really appreciate it. Please feel free to email me. Don't email me till Monday or you're going to get lost in the conference out of office situation, and I make no promises. Monday, though, you will be at the top of my list. So thank you all so much. Have a great weekend, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you for joining us.